So, for my background, my name is BJ Swain. I've been involved in magic and various forms of occultism and paganism for over 30 years. I've done a wide array of stuff, initiated through the OTO, the AA, the Order of the Celestial Academy, which is probably the most relevant one for today because that was kind of an Orthodox Jewish-led variant of the Golden Dawn. Order of the Celestial Academy. I don't believe it operates anymore. It was a very small group, but they were out of Massachusetts, if they're still around. And also did kind of like some of your typical neo-pagan stuff, did Reconstructionist paganism, explored historical versions of witchcraft. So not so much the tradcraft scene, because that's still kind of a constructed post-Wicca witchcraft, but looking at earlier versions of it. An important thing for my background to understand for this class is I am not Jewish. I worked in a Jewish community for about 10 years, have been around a lot of Jewish culture, but myself am not Jewish. And so I don't want to make any claims to speak for Judaism or speak for the Jewish people, and don't want to attempt to appropriate anything that does not belong to me. So I've worked very closely with a lot of my friends who are Jewish magicians to make sure that the way that I'm presenting this material is appropriate and not stepping on any toes or ways that would be uncomfortable for people. My background with this type of material, though, I was first introduced to the Merkava and Chechalot systems in college, studying with a rabbi who was a doctor of Jewish mysticism, initially in a course and then continued corresponding with him after that course for a while, and also exposed to Jewish Kabbalah and other forms of Jewish mysticism and magic through working with him. Then continued studying those things on my own, and then was in the Order of the Celestial Academy, where they sort of worked a Golden Dawn system, but they drew on Jewish Kabbalah, drew on traditional alchemy, and kind of went back to the pre-Golden Dawn sources for that. And actually, the first time that I presented on the Merkava and Chechalot was for the conclave for the Order of the Celestial Academy. And part of this book, which is one of the first books that I'm aware of that's written by a magician for magicians dealing with that system. The first part of the book is a research paper that I wrote on the subject back 21 years ago in order to get admittance into the Order of the Celestial Academy, because part of its function was as a research fraternity. And so obviously ideas have changed, and I've developed and grown a lot since I wrote that. So there are significant portions where I went through and added editorial commentary and was like, well, this was how I understood it at the time, but having researched more, this is probably actually what this was, or I would probably look at this way now. But I wanted to make sure people could kind of see what my original thinking was, and it didn't look like I was claiming to understand things back then that I understood now. So you get to see the process unfolding of how ideas develop, as well as how to go through and approach reconstructing a system with the book, which I hope is interesting for people. But so we're going to talk more about Chechalot and Merkava as we get towards the end of the class, but I'm going to talk about them a little bit now since I've brought the book up. The Merkava sometimes is referred to as the earliest system of Jewish mysticism, and often kind of treated as if the earliest forms of Jewish magic are connected with that. And that's to say that Jewish magic begins with the Merkava is a little bit goofy, because all cultures have magic, and so the idea that there is no Jewish magic until about the Hellenizing period is really wonky, since it's an incredibly old and long-standing culture. But as far as mysticism goes, we don't necessarily have a lot of records of mystical practice before that. And even with the Merkava, there's debate about evidence as whether or not there was mystical practice or just mystical exegesis and reflection with the Merkava. It's very likely that there were forms of Jewish mysticism before that, though, because having a long-standing religious tradition, devotional practices will eventually lead to mystical practices, and it doesn't take 800 years for that to happen. So the Merkava is generally the exegesis and reflection on the throne of God, and the you can include with that the shape and nature of the body of God and the structure of heaven, which technically is Shir Koma, a sort of separate form of mystical exegesis and reflection, but it occurs within that same period and within the same writings and texts. So I'd like to think of it as a subset of the Merkava, and given that the Merkava is reflecting on descriptions of the throne of God or descriptions of the chariot of God, then the throne is essentially God's body. It's God's body combined with the angels that form the structure of the throne. And so to separate Merkava and Shir Koma seems like a very difficult concept to me. It makes sense to treat them together. A lot of the texts where we see explorations of visions of the heavens and mystics traveling to see the throne of God also get into intense descriptions of the heavens and the size of the heavens and the numbers of angels in the heavens, and those are all elements of Shir Koma. But they're in texts where we see these throne descriptions and these throne visions as well. So there's a consistent intermingling of the two systems. Parallel with the Merkava was the Maaseh Bereshit, the work of creation. And so if you're familiar with Sefer Yetzirah, that's a work of creation text, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we get down the line as well. But the Merkava, generally, you would look at that as fitting through about the 3rd or 4th century BCE, up through the first few centuries of the Common Era. And then there's kind of a shift where we start to see more practical texts and texts that talk about how these rabbis were calling angels, how these rabbis were ascending the heavens, and what the processes were for that. And that tends to be referred to as the Hechalot literature. Merkava means throne or chariot, Hechalot means palace. And so in the apocryphal texts and the texts that describe the throne and describe the heavenly visions, there's a series of generally 7 heavens that mystics move through before they reach the final heaven and reach the throne. In the Chechalot texts, sometimes people assume that the palaces are the heavens because there are 7 palaces as well. But the palaces exist either within or beyond the 7th heaven. The 7th heaven is Erevot. And so you enter into Erevot, and sometimes it's described as there is a gap that you have to move beyond to go into an 8th or 9th or 10th heaven, or simply just going through this gap to reach the palace, or simply that the palace is there in Erevot. And then there's a process of moving through the palaces based on knowing the names of the angels that guard the gates of the palaces, knowing the seals that belong to the angels, and then the angels carry you through until you are announced in the 6th heaven, and a chariot is constructed for you to have the angel Anpiel pull you in to the final palace, into the throne room, where you see the vision of God, which, if you go through the apocryphal literature, is a very transforming experience. The vision of the throne is what transforms the patriarch Enoch into Metatron, the highest angel in heaven. So that's essentially the background of those systems, which, again, that's what is dealt with in Adjuring the Voice and the Glory. And we're going to come back to that, although we talked a lot about what's there with that right there. Before we get into the systems before the Kabbalah, though, we need to kind of look at the Kabbalah, because there is a common thought that a lot of people have that all Jewish mysticism and all Jewish magic is Kabbalah. And that's not just an outsider perspective, that's a perspective that occurs within a lot of Judaism as well. Hermetic Kabbalah is the Kabbalah that most magicians, most neo-pagans most pagans will be familiar with. And often within the Hermetic Kabbalah, there is a focus on letter mysticism, particularly the way that it manifests within Thelema, which is probably one of the more prolific sources for it at the current time. The Golden Dawn approach to it doesn't focus as much on the letter mysticism, but focuses more on the idea of the Kabbalah as a kind of cosmic or divine filing cabinet. And that's, I believe, Israel Regardie actually describes it as a filing cabinet in Garden of Pomegranates, which I'm gonna take a moment and I'm gonna say some stuff about Israel Regardie, because Garden of Pomegranates is a horrible book. The actual Garden of Pomegranates by Moshe Cordovero, I believe. Not that one. Not saying that's a horrible book. But Regardie kind of like trashes the traditional Kabbalah and the work of the Safed mystics as he names his book after one of their books. And it's kind of like, what are you doing, dude? Like, and reducing it to this filing cabinet, it's like, it's this such a beautiful and deep system of mystical exegesis and exploration that has so many different pieces and parts and modes of exploring the soul, modes of exploring salvation, modes of exploring creation. And to say that it's just about how we can say these Egyptian gods are the same as these Greek gods, are the same as these Celtic gods, are the same as these candle colors, are the same as these incenses. It's like, guys, like, it doesn't have to be instrumentalized like that. It doesn't have to be just this utilitarian thing. And the idea of correspondences is inherent to actual Kabbalah. Like, that is one of the things that is described as sort of the genius of the Zohar, is that the Zohar is able to take the scriptures and answer why the scriptures are what they are, answer why God says to do the things that he says to do and why not to do the things that you're not to do, because of how the things on earth correspond to the things in heaven. So that basis for the idea of correspondence is there in the traditional Kabbalah, but it's not this just like, all right, let's reach in and tab A and tab A in this system and tab A in this system are all the same, and now we can put together a ritual. There is a lot of utility to that approach for building rituals and building magical operations. But as we'll talk about in a minute, there's ways you can do that where you don't have to try to make it Kabbalah. So the Hermetic Kabbalah derives from Christian Kabbalah, which gets started like almost as soon as the Jewish Kabbalah does. And that's one of the things where Hermetic Kabbalah and Christian Kabbalah, there are elements of those that are appropriative, and a lot of Jewish people do bring that up. But also at this point, Christian Kabbalah has been around for the same 800 years. So like, it's kind of like you can't necessarily put it back in the bag, except that no one really does Christian Kabbalah. Like, everyone kind of just does Hermetic Kabbalah, so maybe you can put it back in the bag. But Pico della Mirandola is often looked at as the first Christian Kabbalist. And he is, actually, I guess there is actually a little bit more of a gap, because he's from the 15th century. He is kind of an interesting, important figure for the beginning of the Renaissance, also significant in some witch trial history, and there's some kind of really interesting stuff where he has these women that he was championing for canonization that were women that he knew in his life. But basically they're witches. They just are people that he thought were holy. So like, they do spirit flight, they engage with spirits, they battle people on a spiritual plane, travel far off to other places, and then bring back evidence that their spirit went to these places. So all the things that would have been described as things witches did in Italy at the time, these women that he viewed as saintly were doing. But he was also involved in the prosecution of witches, and then there were also like people in his family that were accused and tried of witchcraft, and so he's got sort of every angle of it. So if that's a subject you're interested in, he's kind of an interesting character to look at for that. But he studied actual Jewish Kabbalists. He wasn't just kind of making things up on his own. He did actually go through and look at texts by Jewish scholars and by rabbis and learn and develop his ideas from that. Johannes Reuchlin was another important Christian Kabbalist, and he's the one that most people in kind of magical areas have heard of because he's the one that influenced a lot of important Renaissance magical writers. And so he's another one who also, he worked with actual Jewish sources and was actually kind of trying to pull together these ideas from actual Jewish material. But then you get Athanaeus Kircher, who also a name that will probably be familiar to a lot of people because the Kircher tree is a popular design for the Tree of Life. And that's something to understand, that the Tree of Life and the system of Sephiroth is not always one set design of circles and paths or spheres and paths. You can have infinite ways of designing it. You can have the Sephiroth all concentric with each other. You can have them arrayed in different ways. There's lots of ways to think about and explore them and relate how these different elements of God interact with each other. But that's kind of a thing with the Christian Kabbalah and the Hermetic Kabbalah, is it's very locked into this this one particular set of path alignments, essentially, and like a couple little variations on it, but not much. Kircher did not study Jewish sources. Kircher studied some spurious sources that kind of claim to be Jewish, but there's criticisms of them that none of the quotations in it, none of the material in it actually come from any real sources. They're just things that someone put together and claimed were these Jewish materials, but weren't. The Christian Kabbalah is overall a problematic exercise. It viewed the Sephiroth as existing with correspondences to Christian figures like Christ and Mary, which that in and of itself, not especially problematic. It is kind of taking something from another religion and saying like, hey, our religious figures, our gods are the figures that are attached to this. And that can be a little bit awkward, but sometimes that is also how religions communicate and develop. Where it gets more problematic is that it was viewed as a tool for converting Jews. And so this idea of like, hey, if we kind of take their mystical ideas and their theosophy and their ways of explaining God and the esoteric engagement of God, and we make it Christian, then we can be like, hey, well, you're kind of already us almost. You need to just come and be us. And this proves that what we're doing is the actual right thing, and you guys have the incomplete version of it. And that's where it comes into this idea that it is a tool for proving the eternal nature of Christian revelation, which was a big thing in medieval thought. It was sort of this idea that this proved that Judaism always held the seed of Christianity and was therefore an incomplete form of Christianity, and that Christianity had always existed as the true religion before Christ was born on earth. And Judaism was just kind of there waiting for that final step of revelation. And that is a very Christian way of looking at Jewish messianism, is that it's that, hey, like part of the story is revealed, but you guys are waiting for the last part, but we know it's happened already, and you guys just need to realize it's happened already. And so there was this sort of idea that taking the Kabbalah and turning it into a Christian variant was a way of proving this process, that Christianity had always been the real thing the whole time. And so this idea was that Judaism was really just proto-Christianity, was sometimes used as a justification in the early medieval period and the early high medieval period by Christian writers to justify accepting Jews and tolerating Jews. England, for example, did not have any Jewish people there until William the Conqueror took over and brought Jews in to do economic labor that Christians were not allowed to do. And some of the writers who were supporting William doing that, they used these ideas, which had been expressed earlier by writers like Bede, which would be like 9th century or 10th century, that Judaism was already basically Christianity, and these were just people who were waiting to become Christians, and so it's okay to have them there. But then that idea becomes an impetus for the necessity of converting Jews. And the idea that it's like if they're part of the genesis of the true faith, they need to actually become part of that true faith, and we need to make that happen. And so when conversions don't happen, that gets turned on its head and becomes a way of accusing them of being guilty of not accepting this revelation or rejecting this revelation that should be apparent to them, because you're already so close to it, you should see it. And so then this necessity of conversion becomes a justification for social and economic restriction, and then later an execution for violence and exile. And so essentially Christian Kabbalah becomes part of this history of taking elements of Jewish culture and then using them for Christian supremacy and then for Christian oppression and violence. And that's where you start to get all of the different acts of removal and acts of exile that start occurring around the 13th century throughout Europe. So, I mean, those are happening before the Kabbalah, but it's the same ideas that are going through them, and some of them do overlap and are after the development of the Christian Kabbalah as well, because that kind of spans a few hundred years where that's going on. So addressing Christian Kabbalah significantly, again, part of that is because people in the pagan community and the magical community are mostly going to be familiar with variants of Hermetic Kabbalah and variants of Christian Kabbalah more than with Jewish Kabbalah. And the differences between them are not always apparent. And we're not going to go through and break down the actual like philosophies and ideologies of Christian Kabbalah or Hermetic Kabbalah or Jewish Kabbalah, because we're going to mostly focus on stuff from before that. But it's important to recognize that they are very different, and there are significant differences. And so even if someone is comfortable engaging with Hermetic Kabbalah and finds that meaningful for their practice and meaningful for their life, it wouldn't be appropriate to go to Jewish people and be like, hey, let me tell you about Kabbalah and how this works, because what you're learning is something that's completely different and is not really relevant, because actual Jewish Kabbalah is deeply based in scripture and scriptural exegesis, and deeply based in a tradition of exegesis and a tradition of explanation and debating and exploring scriptural meaning. But if we're also delineating and saying that there is Jewish mysticism that isn't Kabbalah, then we want to break down these categories and understand these categories. And those are things that people don't always get as separate. Like we said in the beginning, that even within Jewish culture and Jewish community, a lot of people do kind of think of Kabbalah as just spanning the whole time of all Jewish mysticism. Now, with the Hermetic Kabbalah, I did mention earlier that you can kind of take this idea of these correspondences and look at them outside of the context of Kabbalistic work. Agrippa has tables for correspondences throughout, I think it's the second book of the three books of occult philosophy. And Agrippa is influenced by early Christian Kabbalistic writers, but he doesn't really present these tables in a way where it's locked into this Kabbalistic explanation or Kabbalistic thinking. In fact, most of Agrippa is drawing on Platonism and drawing on ideas that survive from Platonism. And part of his importance is that he preserves elements of that we don't necessarily still have text for from that existed at his period but are lost to us now. So you can take those philosophies of Platonism, philosophies of Hermeticism, and build a same structure for these ideas of correspondences. These ideas of things corresponding are built into those philosophical structures as well, which we can approach in ways that aren't appropriative because they're fundamental to the development of our culture anyway. And we talked a little bit about the idea that people kind of mistake Kabbalah as a term for all Jewish mysticism. And it should be noted that in like a common noun form, like a lowercase k Kabbalah, you could say that all of it is Kabbalah because the word refers to something that's been received. It refers to tradition. And so any spiritual teaching or magical teaching or mystical teaching that is the inheritance of the Jewish community, whether it's the system of Sephiroth or knowledge of emanation or some earlier teaching, is part of received tradition. And so arguably you could still use that term. Let's see. So the Jewish Kabbalah emerges around the 12th century. So what we're going to talk about are things that are generally either overlapping the 12th and 13th century or before that. Because it's not like one system starts and that's a hard stop for any other system. Different schools of mystical thought and different schools of exegesis will coexist at times. There are some theories that the Kabbalah pre-exists the 12th century, that there were groups of scholars and mystics that may have met and studied, debated and discussed, and possibly practiced without recording their teachings. And that element of possibly practiced is kind of an important thing to understand, because sometimes it's not entirely clear looking at early mystical texts how much of them were just exegetic and just about reflection and teaching versus how much of them involved actual ritual, esoteric practice and actual things that a person engaged with in an active spiritual basis beyond meditation and reflection. And of course, looking at a point before the 12th century where we don't have any written records, it's even harder to say whether they were practicing or just kind of reflecting on these things, if they were even reflecting on and discussing them in a manner similar to the Kabbalah at all. The first Kabbalistic text is the Sefer HaBahir, which again, 12th century, developed in the provincial Jewish community. And so a lot of times like we'll talk about Ashkenazi Jewry and Sephardic Jewry. Provincial Jewry was a separate French region, and there's actually a lot of really interesting medieval esoteric stuff that happens in the provincial region. We're not going to talk about those things because that's the stuff where earlier I mentioned like, oh, there's some stuff that's actually medieval that is after the Kabbalah that's kind of cool but doesn't really fit what we're doing. But there's a lot of cool stuff in the provincial region there. Now, a lot of people would say, well, the Sefer Yetzirah, that's before the Bahir, that's before the 12th century, and that's a Kabbalah text. Like, how does that not make the Kabbalah older? The Sefer Yetzirah is a Maseh Bereshit text, not a Kabbalah text. It does talk about Sefirot, but it doesn't explain what they are. It doesn't lay out a system of emanation. It doesn't lay out any model for them. It doesn't say what they do or how they work. And so the term was later used in the Kabbalah, and elements that are described in the Sefer Yetzirah inspired the Kabbalah and informed it, but it wasn't written as part of that community of scholars and teachers who were putting together Kabbalistic thinking. The Sefer Yetzirah is traditionally attributed to Abraham, but was written around the time that the Zohar was attributed to. So the Zohar was written in the 13th century and is a Sephardic text. And it really is like the first place that we get like the expansion of this system of Sephiroth. And it was attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a Jewish rabbi in the 2nd century. He was a student of Rabbi Akiva. And for anyone who has any familiarity with the Merkavah or Chechalot, you will have probably heard of Rabbi Akiva, or if you're just a big Talmud fan, then he's an important Talmudic rabbi. He's probably my favorite historical rabbi. But Rabbi Akiva was taken prisoner and tortured and killed by the Romans, and Shimon watched this. And he looked at him as his beloved master, his beloved teacher, and he resented the Romans for this and spoke out against the Romans. And this was reported by one of his former students. And so he was sentenced to death and had to go into hiding. He went into hiding with his son and stayed in a cave for 12 years. And God caused a tree to grow to give them food and a spring to burst in the cave to give them water so they could survive. And through this time, they studied the Torah and according to the Zohar, they wrote the Zohar. And there's a lot of people today that still believe that Shimon wrote the Zohar. When I was in school, and actually our professor was Ashkenazi, but a lot of the students were Sephardic, and he was like, yeah, this is really very much in the Sephardic community. A lot of these mystical stories and ideas about the mystical history are kind of taken as, yep, that's how it happened. And I, not having that awareness directly of the community, kind of have to take his word for it. But the kids in the class who were Sephardic, they were kind of like, what? You mean it didn't happen that way? But you can find a lot of websites that still, they're just like, yep, and Shimon known for writing the Zohar. And so it's still very much a thought people have. And there is some debate amongst historians about the origin of the Zohar and who wrote it. Moses de Leon published it. And we know it was not an earlier text because the form of Aramaic used in it was not the one that would have been used in the 2nd century. De Leon's wife apparently claimed that De Leon wrote it. The story that I was told was that people offered to, a wealthy man offered to have his son marry De Leon's daughter after De Leon's death in exchange for the original manuscript of the Zohar. And his wife was like, there is no original manuscript. He just made it up himself. So I don't know if that is an apocryphal story or if that is something there's a real record of. But if it's true, it would be pretty good evidence that he wrote it. There are some scholars, though, that think that it could be slightly older, that there may have been a group of rabbis that included De Leon, or that maybe went back a generation or two before him, and that they had what started as an oral tradition and then began writing that oral tradition down and collectively produced this text. Because it is a massive text, and for an individual to create that and create this entire system would be kind of mind-blowing. There are several other figures in the development of Kabbalistic writing around the medieval period, notably Abraham Abulafia, who's one of my favorite Kabbalists. He wrote several books on practical mysticism. So like earlier where it said, it's kind of hard to tell what things were just reflection and what things were actual things people practiced. Abulafia has these entire systems of kind of like moving and looking in different directions based on the natural letters in a word, or natural vowels in a word, and different like breathing exercises and ways of thinking about the flow of divine energy, where he's actually like clearly describing to you how to engage these principles. And it is a good example of like how the Kabbalah is not always just this system of emanation, this system of Sephirot. But what's important about Abulafia is he's an early Kabbalistic messianic figure. There are a lot of messiahs who are Kabbalists or potential messiahs. There's an idea that every generation has the two potential messiahs, because there are two messiahs, not one, born into that generation. And depending on the fitness of the generation to receive the messiah, and depending on the acts of the potential messiah and the people around them, they could develop into being the messiah or not. And there are several Kabbalists who announced themselves as the messiah and did things the messiah was supposed to do, like challenging the institutional power of the time and declaring that it must become a Jewish power instead of a power that was oppressing the Jews. And nothing happened of it. Shpatai Zvi is another really famous one. He's one that another presenter here, Sarah Mastros, she writes and teaches a lot about Zvi and about his wife, who is not paid attention to in history as much, but is apparently also a very interesting figure. So as the Kabbalah was developing, mostly developed amongst Sephardic Jews initially, but in the early medieval period and early high medieval period, the high medieval period starts around the beginning of the 11th century and goes from there. The medieval period starts arguably 5th or 6th century, and that's like your sort of early medieval period. Ashkenazi Jewry had their own mystical and magical practices and movements that predated the Kabbalah and were concurrent with it. Some of these elements continued and stemmed from the Chehalot system. Some were basically forms of grimoire magic. The Sidei Ashkenaz, or the pietists, Ashkenazi or pietists of Germany, were known to use Nodrikon, Gematria, and Tamora, which are forms of letter mysticism that are very popular in modern magical Kabbalah. And so those elements that a lot of times people today think of as this is what Kabbalah is. Kabbalah is Gematria. It's like, well, no, like Gematria was really popular with these people like further east, and they were doing it before the Kabbalah was generated. But these systems of letter mysticism go back at least to the development of the Talmud and may go back before the Hellenistic period. It's kind of hard to say when they started exactly, but those are some things that those actually kind of survived and influenced the development of the Kabbalah also, and kind of were moved into it, but they predated. Now, magic in Israel is super ancient. So, again, this idea that it was all Kabbalah, or this idea that like the Merkavah kind of got it started. No, there's always been magic going on there, and a lot of our early examples of literate culture come from the region of Israel. And anytime we have examples of ancient literate culture, we have examples of ancient magical culture. So the city of Ugarit, which was a major Bronze Age Canaanite city, kind of flourished between the 19th and 11th centuries BCE. That was a city that overlapped with areas that became Jewish areas, and a lot of scholars in recent decades have pointed to the fact that Ugaritic mythology is essentially a precursor to Hebrew mythology. That a lot of times people will talk about how, oh, the Romans, they just took Greek mythology, which is not what happened. That is not at all what happened. But there are elements where they have things coming from the same sources and are informed by the same sources. And then, yes, the Romans were informed by the Greeks directly because they enslaved a bunch of Greek teachers. But there's all the stories of like the Jews kind of coming into the land of Canaan and taking it over, but archaeology and genetic information shows that the Jews were probably indigenous to the land of Canaan and were the same people as the Canaanites, but a shift in religious identity and linguistic identity occurred over time, and then they became a separate people that eventually became the dominant people in the region. And looking at the mythological, the surviving myths from Ugarit, we see characters that we see in the Hebrew scriptures doing things that we see them doing in the Hebrew scriptures. And so we can see a path of mythological inheritance there like we see for other cultures. So there's a fair chance that Ugaritic culture was something that heavily informed early Judaic culture or early Hebrew culture. We still have surviving elements of Ugaritic magic. We have inscriptions, we have texts that show ritual practices, show apotropaic magic, show necromantic magic that survive from the Bronze Age. And so we know magic was being done by these people who were culturally influential on the Hebrews, if not an earlier precursor or related community or related society to the Hebrews. Excuse me. In recent decades, an ivory tusk comb was found in Lachish from about 1700 BCE, and is the oldest surviving sentence written in an alphabet. And it says, "May this tusk root out the lice of the hair and the beard." Lachish was a major city in the kingdom of Judah. The comb is from the Canaanite period, but the same Proto-Sinaitic alphabet that informed Canaanite writing, informed Hebrew writing, and so there's a point where it's essentially the same writing systems that are happening there, and so distinguishing based on the writing system can be difficult, and so you have to kind of look at the nature of the text and then also like linguistic elements of the text to determine who it belonged to. But the area where the comb was found became an important Yahwist territory, and so it was an important territory in the development of the Hebrew people as a separate people, even if it was like a little bit after the point that this comb was created that happened. But the comb's clearly an example of apotropaic magic. You have a particular material. The material is being called upon by the inscription. The fact that there is an inscription on it at all would have been potentially magical in that period. Likely they would have spoken the inscription as they would have written it on the comb. And that it not only implores the material to do this, uses the words to do this, but has a specific thing that it is telling it to do beyond the basic function of the comb. In the 6th or 7th century BCE, there are the Ketov Hinnom scrolls, which are silver scrolls that contain the earliest surviving examples of Hebrew scripture. These are believed to be funerary talismans because they were buried with people. They were found in a burial cave. And they're interpreted as protection and blessing amulets and talismans for the dead, which is very similar to the Orphic gold tablets that we see amongst the Greeks, where they'll have the Orphic oath inscribed on a metal scroll or tablet and placed with the dead as a protective measure to guide them through the underworld. Jewish apocryphal texts give us bases for magic and show that magic was at least something that was on the minds of Jewish writers and Jewish scripturists during the period that they were written. The Book of Giants, which probably dates to at least the 3rd or 4th century BCE, as part of one of the books of Enoch, explains that humans were taught magic by the angels. So the angels, they look down and they're like, man, those humans are hot. Like, God doesn't want us going and doing those things the humans do, but it looks pretty cool and the humans are beautiful. We're going to go get us some humans. And so the angels come down and they're like, hey, we're angels, we're cool. Marry us. We'll teach you magic. Like, we'll teach you cosmetics, which cosmetics was a form of magic at that era. We'll teach you smithing and war. We'll teach you all kinds of things that God doesn't want you to know. And so God is like, what is going on? The world is horrible. These angels have had monster giant babies with these humans, and they're ravenous, and they're eating all the food, and they're eating the humans, and they're eating each other, and this is not what's supposed to happen, and the humans are crying out for help. And so he sends Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, because it's always those four, sends them down to take care of it all. So they get there and they're like, all right, we're going to regulate. This is not happening. They lock up Shemiyaza and the angels that decided to do this. But first, they force these angels to watch their children, the Nephilim, be killed. And then they lock them in the earth until the end of the world. And the souls of the Nephilim become demons. And the Book of Giants doesn't really get deeper into it past that point, but we have in the Book of Giants the basis that it's like, okay, these angels taught humans magic. Another version of the story in a different Book of Enoch is that King Enosh, who's different than the patriarch Enoch, he conjured the 7 lights of heaven to come down away from the face of God and stand before him, and essentially embodied them in materials on earth so that he could command them. And he was taught this by Uzziel and other angels. And so basically what they're describing there is he is doing astrological talismanic magic. He is creating living statues and pulling these heavenly powers down and commanding them through these statues instead of allowing them to be under God's purview. And this is the sin that causes the flood. Similarly, the Nephilim and all the sinfulness and destruction on earth as a result of the Nephilim is the cause of the flood. And so the flood is always tied to this idea of angels coming down, teaching humans things they're not supposed to know, and these things generally are magical things. The Book of Jubilees takes up that story and continues it, and the demons that have arisen from the souls of the Nephilim torment mankind. And so after the flood has receded and Noah is trying to get humanity started again, he cries out to God and he's like, I can't do this. You have these demons coming and hurting us and doing all these things. You got to make them stop. And so God's like, yeah, no, that's a problem. I'll get rid of them. And then Mastema, which I'm not ever sure if that's supposed to be a name or a title, but he's the leader of the demons. He's like, God, dude, if you take all my demons away, how can I torment humans? Like, that's not cool. I'm supposed to be able to torment these humans, and I need my demons to do that. And so God's like, oh, well, you got a point too. So God decides that a portion of the demons will be locked away, and a portion of them will remain with Mastema in order to torment humans. But he sends the angels to teach Noah the secrets of herbs and plants, and also how to call upon divine powers to stop the demons. And so essentially the angels come and they teach Noah magic in order to stop vexing demons. And so we have this idea that like God is establishing magic. Similarly, there are magical texts and myths where the angel Ratziel, the angel of secrets, is sent by God as a mercy to Adam after Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. And Adam is given a book of sapphires that has magical secrets that are taught to him by Ratziel. And so there's frequently this idea that, again, the angels teach magic, and sometimes that's bad, and everything is destroyed because of it. But sometimes God's telling the angels to do this. And sometimes it's like, hey, this person is righteous, or this person has the potential to be righteous, or things are really difficult and we want this person to succeed. Go teach them magic. Go help them by giving them these secrets that will allow them to do things. And we're going to revisit that when we look at one of the Jewish grimoires. The demons. There are lots of demons. Demons are not only the deceased souls of the Nephilim. The Lilith, after Cain slays Abel, Adam goes off and is in mourning in a cave. And Lilith is just like, all right, I can take this. I can take advantage of this. And she goes and takes Adam's seed nightly for the years that he's in the cave and gives birth to demons from it. And there are various other ways where spilled seed becomes the source of demons. And so Ashmedai and the demons that are of his class of demons, that's where they come from. So they are sort of partially human and partially these spiritual beings. And so they have wings like angels, but they have other elements that make them human-like. The Talmud describes them. So this is like an actual... So something being in the Talmud doesn't mean that it's like this is the orthodox rule that everyone has to think this way. So it's not like canon law or church tradition in Catholicism, or whiny, angry, we hate everything writing in Protestantism. It's more like, hey, these are some things some people think. These are some things some people experience. These are our arguments about why Scripture is understood this way, or why the world works this way based on what we know from Scripture. And so there are some things that have to do with how things are practiced, and those are things where how law is interpreted. And some of those are things that are more consistently held as like, yes, this is an actual thing where we're supposed to treat this law this way, or we're supposed to treat this ritual practice this way. And there are other things that are more like, this is kind of our folk knowledge, these are our folk ways, these are our ways of understanding the spiritual world, and these are our stories, and you can kind of believe them, you can kind of learn from them, but not everyone has to take them whole stock that way. So the fact that there are explanations of demons in the Talmud doesn't mean that every Jewish person has to believe there are demons and believe they work this way, but it does mean that there's space in official Jewish teaching where demons are addressed, and so where the belief in demons can be an acceptable belief there and something that's understood there. And one of the ideas that's expressed is that there are so many demons that if a person's eyes were open to see them, they wouldn't be able to like accomplish anything or do anything because they'd be so overwhelmed by the massive demons throughout the world. These demons have different powers. They can fly, they can ascend up to heaven and listen to what's happening in the courts of heaven. And then they can come back and tell people things about the future because they know what's ordained in the heavenly spheres before it happens. And so that's another thing, is that the demons in Judaism are not infernal beings that are necessarily cast down below the earth. So like the angels that are fallen, and so you'll see a lot of like magical writers and Christian writers who are like, so yeah, Judaism doesn't actually have fallen angels. There's no war in heaven in Judaism. That's something that Christians kind of came up with as a mistake. And it's like, well, no, it actually comes from the Enochic tradition, and it's something that predates Christianity by 300 to 400 years. And there are other Jewish scriptural sources that have these things where angels mess up and angels get punished. The Tale of the Martyrs has the angel Samael. He's the Prince of Rome, and he's just like on it, like, yeah, these rabbis, they need to be punished. They're the reincarnation of Joseph's brothers, and they beat him and sold him into slavery, and they were never punished for that. So these rabbis have to be executed, and these are like the most important rabbis. And so the rabbis choose Rabbi Ishmael to ascend to heaven, and he is like, hey, is this ordained by heaven? Do we have to allow ourselves to be executed by the Romans? And God's like, I don't want this to happen, but Samael is right. This is the law. Samael, you can make Rome do this because he's the Prince of Rome, so he influences the Roman emperor, the Roman general. And he's like, but if you do, you're done, like, because I don't want this, but it's the law, so you're allowed to do it. So Samuel's like, yeah. And so Samuel, like, causes, I think it's Vespasian probably, to execute these rabbis. And so God casts Samuel into the divine fire to unmake Samael, because angels are made from divine fire, and angels can be unmade in the divine fire. And so we have a source there where it's kind of setting up the same sort of thing that we see in the Christian revelation, where the adversary is cast down into the fire. So there are these stories where there are angels that do things God doesn't like, or where angels rebel and do things that they're not supposed to do and they get punished for it. And those angels are kind of put away forever, or put away till the end of creation, or sort of semi-destroyed. But those angels are also not the demons, whereas in Christianity, the fallen angels, they become the demons who are bound to do magic for sorcerers, or who are bound to torment or lead men astray. So there's, and actually, so the, normally my classes don't like plug a book a whole bunch, but this class I was like, I gotta start teaching classes that relate to the books that I'm releasing. And so this is like the first time I'm doing that. So hopefully I'm doing this smoothly where it's not overboard. But
good.
Thank you. In Adjuring the Voice and the Glory, it takes the Testament of Solomon, which is one of the early Jewish magical texts that describes the demons, describes what their powers are, who they are, how Solomon called upon them. And it takes the story of Solomon and Ashmedai, and it takes the Talmudic teachings about the demons and puts them all together in sort of a mythological retelling of these things. So it's kind of a really easy way to digest some multiple streams of these Jewish teachings on demons. So since I mentioned the Testament of Solomon and I've mentioned Solomon and Ashmedai, in the Talmud, Solomon is building the temple, and he needs this shamir, which is not really described what it is, but it's something that can cut through a rock that Solomon needs cut through. And he needs to find this, and so some of his advisors are like, I bet some demons know where it would be. And so they go and they get a male and a female demon and beat the crap out of them and are like, tell us where it is. And they're like, we don't know, please stop. Our king, Ashmedai, he probably knows. And Ashmedai is just like, yep, I fly up to heaven and I spend my day listening to the courts of heaven and learning about the Torah and learning about God's will. And then I come back down to earth and I study more. And then I drink some water from my pool of water near my cave, and I rest and go to sleep, and I do the same thing the next day. And so Ashmedai is actually sort of presented at first as if he's like this righteous, scholarly figure. And so Solomon sends one of his people to go get Ashmedai, and he's like, here is a chain with the name of God on it. Here is a vessel of wine. Cover Ashmedai's water so that he can't get it, and leave the wine so that's all he has to drink. And then when he's drunk and sleeps, throw the chain on him, and he won't be able to break the chain. And then you can tell him that King Solomon has commanded him to come. And so the servant does this, and at first Ashmedai, he sees he can't get his water, and he sees that all there is wine, and he's like, well, I'm not drinking, I don't do that, that's bad. But he just gets so desperate and so thirsty that he eventually does. And so it's again sort of coding Ashmedai as this sort of righteous behaving figure. And so the servant, he chains Ashmedai and reminds Ashmedai he can't break the chain, and he leads him back to Solomon, and he does a couple things on his way through, and eventually Solomon asks him about him. He's like, well, I was in heaven, and I heard this person's going to have this happen, and this person's going to have that happen. And so it kind of reveals that, he can tell the future about what's going to happen because he's been up to heaven and hears it. But then Solomon, always too curious, Solomon asks Ashmedai what he can do. And Ashmedai is like, well, I can do this. And I think somehow he gets Solomon's ring from him. And then he takes his wings, and he's like, look what I can do with my wings. And he knocks Solomon far off so that he's expelled from the kingdom. And then Ashmedai takes the form of Solomon and pretends to be him. But he does all these unrighteous things. And that shows all of the advisors that he is clearly not Solomon, because he's clearly doing some really horrible stuff. And then there's various stories about how Solomon gets back. And so some of the legends about Solomon capturing demons and putting them in the brass vessel, some of the Arabic stories of Solomon, it's they deal with this period where Solomon's gone. Sometimes Solomon becomes unrighteous himself and then is guided back to righteousness during this period. And so there's a lot of versions of this story outside of just the Talmudic version. But that's one version that establishes Solomon's relationship with the demons. The Testament of Solomon tells another story. And the Testament of Solomon, fairly early text, somewhere between the 1st century of the Common Era and the 10th century of the Common Era. It's kind of debated, and that is a huge range, but it's kind of debated when it was written. And I think part of the debate is because as the magical treatise of Solomon, the Hygromantia texts, develop, they have descriptions of demons that are believed to be from a lost version of the Testament of Solomon. And so Hadean Press has an edition of Recension C of the Testament of Solomon by Brian Johnson. And Recension C is a sort of theoretical or reconstructed text of the Testament of Solomon. The earlier versions that exist, those are actual, as far as I understand, texts where we have manuscript versions of them that have survived, and then there's the question of dating those. and they have different stories between Recensions C and Recensions A and B. Recensions A and B tell a story where there is a worker in the temple, I think one of the lead workers in the temple, and his son works in building the temple as well. And the son is favored by Solomon. He's Solomon's favorite worker. And so Solomon gives him extra provisions, but the boy is wasting away. And he's wasting away because this night demon comes and feeds on him each night. And so Solomon, caring for the boy, asks what's wrong, and the boy explains. And so Solomon goes to God and prays, and God's like, "Here, I will give you wisdom." And he sends, I believe it's the angel Michael. Michael would be the one that makes sense, with a ring, and that ring is a vessel for the divine presence and divine wisdom. And so that elevates Solomon where he can command the demons. And so he gives the ring to the boy and tells the boy to throw the ring at the demon and tell the demon, King Solomon commands you to come forth. And so the boy brings Orneus, the demon, to Solomon, and Orneus is like, "How could you do this to me? Oh my God." And so Solomon's like, "Tell me about yourself. All right, bring me another demon." And so in succession, he goes through all the demons, learning about the demons, and then binding the demons to build parts of the temple. So the whole of the temple ends up being built by these demons that Solomon binds and commands. And then, of course, Solomon makes mistakes, and it all gets away from him, and the demons prophesy that this will happen. But it's a really interesting text because it lays out this essentially a Liber Spiritum, a book of spirits, a demonology, kind of like we would see in like the Ars Goetia, where it lists the demons, lists their powers and their names, but it does it as a story, and it explains Solomon's relationship to these demons, and we kind of see that attempted in later Solomonic texts, where it'll be like Solomon's writing to his son, and he's like, "And here's what happened," but then the actual like descriptions of the spirits or descriptions of the ritual aren't woven into the story at all. Whereas here, it's entirely worked out as this story process, but it doesn't give any actual process of how to conjure the demons. All it is that Solomon gained divine wisdom, and therefore he had the power to command them, and there was a demon nearby, and then he was able to use those demons to call the other demons. Now, that process is one where we do see processes where intermediary spirits are used to call upon other spirits. So it kind of sets up a process, but you'd have to have a spirit first as the first step there. It also explains what angels command the demons. And so if the demons are, because it's very much in that kind of ancient world idea that these demons are vexing spirits and they cause illness, they cause problems, and so you call upon this angel to resolve the problem that the demon is creating. Around the same period, there is the Sword of Moses. The dating for that is basically before the 11th century. So we don't really know when it was written. And the Sword of Moses, Yuval Harari, who wrote a book on Jewish magic before the Kabbalah, he also did a translation of the Sword of Moses. He says that the text kind of establishes God as the God of magic. And so from people not coming from a Jewish perspective, or people from even a modern Jewish perspective, it would be very hard to be like, "Oh, magic's bad, no one does magic," because magic is woven into Jewish culture, and you can go into Jewish shops and still buy amulets and talismans, and this was always the coolest thing for me working in a Jewish community, is people would come in wearing their little protective talismans and things like that, and it's just a thing that everyone accepts, that you need to have these things to keep yourself safe. But from a Christian perspective, where it's okay, magic is bad, and God doesn't want you to do magic, which is very Protestant perspective. For a huge chunk of time in Christianity, there was a lot of magic that was still woven in. And Protestants, in getting rid of magic, they were even just miracles aren't good. Miracles are lies from the devil. Catholics are servants of the Antichrist because they fake these miracles with the help of the devil. They were just like, the world can't have any fun in it. So uh, God compels the angels to help humans magically. God sends an angel in the sword of Moses to find a righteous person to whom to deliver the sword. And the sword is a series of divine names that give power to conjure the angels. There's sort of an implication that God compels the angels to descend and perform magic for the worthy throughout the Sword of Moses. The Sword of Moses is not the only Jewish grimoire. Gal Sofar recently put out a text through Brill and De Gruyter Publishing where he goes over Solomonic magic and kind of establishes the history of Jewish grimoires and Jewish texts that led to the late medieval and early modern Solomonic textual systems, which a lot of scholars have tried to point to as being very Greek, despite the fact that there was clear Jewish influence on these texts. So I've mentioned a couple times, there is a section that it's like, oh, this doesn't really fit the class, and that is the Melechet Shemaim, or the craft of the heavens. And this is that process of working with astrology, working with electional astrology to create talismans, create living statues, perform magical practices, and also conjurations and exegesis and explorations of the Kabbalah. There is some interesting stuff there, but we wouldn't be able to fit in all the other cool stuff if we try to go through that too. Although we are through a lot of it. So the Checholot and Merkava systems. So we've kind of talked about those a little bit already. But they are kind of the other big phase that everyone looks at when looking at Jewish mysticism. And there is a lot of academic literature around them. There's just not a lot of magical literature around them. And that's changing a little bit. I believe Harold Roth has released a text on the Sword of Moses and a text on the Watchers. The Watchers are the Grigori, or the angels who, some of them followed Shemayaza and went after the daughters of men, or followed Utziel and taught men things that were bad because they wanted to trick men into doing bad things to get destroyed. But some of them just kind of like watched and were like, oh crap, our brothers are doing bad things. Well, we're just going to let them do it and not intervene or try to stop it. And so all the Watchers get punished for that. So there are some people writing about those subjects. The Merkava, if you kind of go through the apocryphal texts for that, you will see stories of Enosh, of Abraham, of Moses, of Adam, of Esdras, moving through the heavens and learning the different mysteries of the heavens, and interacting with the angels, and learning how to work with and interact with the angels for magical and spiritual and prophetic purposes. And so with each heaven, there is a hymn of praise. Hymnody is very important in this mystical system. And so the mystic goes into a heaven and learns the hymns of that heaven that the angels sing in praise of God. And so, like, we often talk about, like, the angels that stand before God and say, Kadosh, 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 all throughout the day or at appointed times, just holy, holy, holy. But each heaven has its own choirs of angels that have their own songs that they sing in praise of God. And so the mystic learns those and then is able to enter that heaven and sing those songs of praise, and is elevated by the process of doing that because they're praising God, and so that helps them in their righteousness. But it makes them more like the angels of that heaven and allows them to interact with the angels of that heaven and kind of exist in a state allied with them. And so then there are frequently magical teachings as well that relate to whatever the mysteries of the heaven is, what exists in that heaven. And the mystic, through having engaged that heaven, is then able to call upon the angels from that heaven for magical purposes. Again, there are 7 heavens. each heaven has its own things that it contains. And so, like, there's the heaven that has the storehouses and treasuries of snow and rain and hail. There's the heaven that has the dragons and Chaldikris that the sun travels through and the moon travels through. And by moving through these heavens, you're able to learn the mysteries of these different elements of nature and these different ways in which God conducts and commands the universe. We also see mystics who move through and they learn about not just, okay, these are the angels in this heaven, this is kind of the story of these angels, this is how you sing the hymns of these angels, but learning overall the choirs of all the angels and who commands the choirs of angels. And that part actually is pretty easy because if you're talking about the Sarim, then Sariel rules the Sarim. If you're talking about the Hashmalim, Hashmael rules the Hashmalim. And so basically, whatever the choir of angel is, it's the god of that choir of angels is the angel that rules that choir. But that kind of becomes important because as you go through each choir, then the leader of that choir is the next greatest angel, the next biggest, next most important angel, and all the other angels prostrate themselves on the ground and bow before this angel and sing praises. And so that's telling us that that angel is the angel that you call upon to work with that choir and command that choir and whatever powers the choir has. And different scriptures describe the heavens differently. So there's not one universal description of, okay, the first heaven deals with these things, the second heaven deals with these things. Each text describes the heavens as sort of fits that text. Second Enosh is one of my favorite versions of it, and that one is almost like an adventure story. Like, it really isn't telling you, like, okay, this is what's in this heaven, and this is what you would, like, conjure for this magic. And the scriptures generally don't tell you the hymns. I believe Apocalypse of Abraham has the hymn for the final heaven, but most of them don't have the hymns in them because, again, you learn them as you go through the heavens. But, like, in Enoch, he meets the watchers who are being punished, and he kind of they ask him to speak to God, and they're hopeful that they could someday be forgiven. And that's something that also happens in First Enoch. So both First and Second Enoch have this idea that the angels do want to be forgiven. And that's something that you will also see in some medieval and early modern magical texts. The Book of the Offices of Spirits, which occurs in VB 26, that's been published as the Book of Oberon, that has references to the angels wanting to return to the heavens and the angels wanting the magician to pray for them. And so when you conjure these demons, then you can offer to them that it's like, well, I will say prayers on your behalf, or because it was kind of assumed that the magician was a priest, I will say mass on your behalf, or I will absolve you through confession so that you'll be able to return to the heavens. And sometimes it's the magician playing tricks. Like, they're not really going to help the demon out. It's kind of like in Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witches, that if you want to conjure a deceased person, you go and dig up the body of a recently hung criminal, and you conjure the soul using the body, and the soul will do things for you because you promise to say a mass on its behalf so that it can be forgiven and then buried in consecrated ground and go to heaven. And so it goes and does the thing, and then you take quicklime and you burn the body and like destroy everything and don't go to a mass for it. And it's like, I don't know why you've got to lie to the spirits in these books, but like that's what they do. So the so the angels, they want to be forgiven. They want to go back to the better part of heaven. And it's interesting in Second Enoch is that the angels, they're not in heaven. They're being punished in like a dark and scary part of heaven. And so like the places of torment and punishment are part of heaven in that structure. And there's even an element where sort of paradise is under a fiery canopy that extends from the tree of life, and that this kind of leads, if you travel around through this heaven fully, to like the darker, more difficult and dangerous part of the heaven. So it's all sort of interwoven in this system instead of separated. And so, it gets to a second heaven that has a portion of the Watchers in it who are also being punished, because the entire choir is being punished, but the ones that are really bad are in one spot, and the ones that were just kind of like, we went along with it or we just let it happen, they're in another spot. And they're just like, we're really sullen and we're mad at God because he's punishing our brothers and he's making us sit here. And Enoch's like, what is your problem? You should love God. God is wonderful. Your brothers love God and they're hopeful to be forgiven and ask me to talk to God for them. Sing your songs of praise. And then the angels, they rise up and they start praising God. And so it's a cool story, but it also is presenting this idea that humans can interact with the angels. Humans can compel the angels and inspire the angels to do things, which is an important basis for magical thinking and exploring magic. The Hekalot system is one that is less directly magical in the sense of the palaces don't unfold new magical access for you. It's the movement through the heavens that does that. But it's with the Hekalot text that we begin to see these practical explanations show up. And so the Sahatorah or Sahar Torah is a story where while the Jews were busy building the temple, they didn't have time to study Torah. And so God hears their sorrow. He hears their pleads that they want a tumult of Talmud. They want numerous legal discussion. This is actually how it's described in the text, which is just amazing. And so he's like, I have the solution for you. I will open the storehouses of the treasuries of Torah. And which that is also like an amazing image. It's like, okay, you've got a treasury for all the snow, a treasury for all the rain, treasury for hail, a treasury for abundant crops, a treasury for scripture and the legal discussion of scripture. And God's just like, this is what people want. I know what people want. I'm going to give this out. And the angels are like, what is wrong with you, God? Humans suck. Don't give them this, because that's what the angels always say. And God's like, no, it's going to be awesome. And so the Sahatorah goes, the prince of the Torah, and he goes and teaches them everything that they didn't have time to learn and time to study because they were being righteous and building the temple. But then there are other stories where people call the prince of the Torah, and it's not necessarily because they were being righteous, or maybe they were being kind of righteous and doing good things, but they didn't know how to do it properly, and so he comes down in a current of fire and destroys everything, which is a recurring element of how teaching about the Merkavah, teaching about the Chechlot is that it's dangerous, that the angels will come down and listen when a talented rabbi is teaching about this subject. And so a ring of fire will show up around the rabbi and the students because the angels are there rejoicing in the righteousness and rejoicing in learning about this as well. But if someone is teaching it and they're teaching it to someone they shouldn't be teaching it to. So theoretically, if I were a first century rabbi and you were all like really righteous, learned people, and I was teaching you about the Merkavah and the mysteries of the Merkavah, that would be okay. And the angels would come down and be like, this is awesome. This is so cool. It's kind of like Sinai when God gave the law. But if you guys weren't righteous, worthy people, then the angels would come and strike me down and destroy me and probably destroy you guys too. And it would be in that same fire that would happen in. So there's an element of danger to this. And I think that's really just sort of a teaching that mystical practice is dangerous if you're not ready for it, which is a thing that people kind of talk about sometimes, but I think people don't actually engage with it. Like, there is a real danger because anything transformative is dangerous. Anything that makes change is dangerous. So any real magic, any real mysticism, there is a danger if it goes wrong, and so you have to be careful with it. One of the really famous stories of the Merkava mystics is the four who went to paradise, or the four who went to the Pardes. And so you have Rabbi Akiva, the awesome rabbi, Rabbi Ben Zoma, Rabbi Ben Azai, and Acher, the other, Elisha Ben Abulia. But you don't say his name because he's naughty. And so Rabbi Akiva teaches them all, and they all ascend to heaven. But Akiva is the only one that is righteous and balanced enough to do this safely. And so he comes in peace and goes in peace. But Ben Azai and Ben Zoma, one of them dies and the other one loses his mind. And Acher sees Metatron sitting on a throne scribing the deeds of Israel. And because Metatron is second only to God, he is the little Yahweh. And so he is righteous enough that he has a throne that is like God's throne. So Acher sees this, and he's like, there are two powers in heaven. There are two gods, which essentially he becomes a Gnostic. And so Gnosticism was something that was very much competing for a spiritual and intellectual space at the time that the Merkava was developing. And so because of this madness that he accepts this heresy, he comes back and he's just like, the whole of the law is turned on its head. Like, he's going to go out and do all the things that the scripture says not to do. And there's almost sort of like a mysticism of heresy behind Acher that kind of could be interesting to explore. But he's also kind of like treated like a boogeyman. And so, but the story, it kind of shows that like the righteous can do this, but even amongst the very righteous, the majority of them will not be righteous enough to do this safely. And so it's something that has to be very careful and cautious practice. Okay, so that got away a little on the time because we had about 19-20 minutes when got to the talking about the Merkava and the Hegilot. And so our last section is on Sefer Haratzim, or the Book of Secrets, which is a late antique text. This one's from the 3rd or 4th century. And the modern version that we have is a reconstruction from fragmentary sources, mostly from the Cairo Geniza. Does everyone know what Genizot are? So if you have a text that has the name of God on it, or is written in scriptural font, it cannot just be thrown away. The text is like a living text. It has power to it. And so you have to encase the text and then bury the text. And these encased texts are a genizot. And so a geniza is the individual text or piece of text that is in a collection of genizot. And so the Cairo genizot has a lot of different things in it, because it's just like, it's basically like your scriptural trash bin. And so you have things that are just like kind of standard scriptural texts, standard religious texts, but then there's other more special ones and interesting ones in there, including these pieces of magical texts that form Sefer Haratzim, or the Book of Secrets. Elements of Sefer Haratzim also continue to exist in Sefer Ratziel HaMalach, which contains abbreviated forms of the text, essentially listing the angels and groups of angels of the heavens, but not the magical practices associated with them. The text itself describes the seven heavens and their natures, and it describes the angels that live in those seven heavens, and the structures of the angels within each heaven, who commands the angels of that heaven, how many choirs or encampments of angels are in each heaven, and then it describes what they do magically and gives detailed magical practices related to those angels. So I had three that I had picked out to go over, but we are kind of up against the clock now. So I'm going to talk about one of them real quick, just so we have an example, because they're really interesting. Because in a sense, it's kind of like what we would think of as grimoire magic. Like, you call upon an angel that is the chief angel, and then you call upon the names of all the other angels, and that's how you magically access them. But the actual magical practices described for them, a lot of them are things that we would think of more as folk magic. And I find it interesting that some of them are things where, to me, they seem really similar to the name is escaping me, but in Abramelin, there is a section that is described as a type of Kabbalah, and it's basically like a bunch of like folk magic type spells. And that's in the German Abramelin text, not in the French Abramelin. But some of them look very similar to the stuff that you see in Sefer HaRetzim, and people kind of debate whether or not Abramelin is actually authentically a Jewish magical text. And that's one of the things where I'm like, people are probably right, it's probably not, but there's probably definitely a stream of Jewish influence there. One of the examples that I had involves going to 7 streams of water and collecting water from 7 streams. And that is something that we see in hoodoo magical practices. And so it's kind of interesting that there's this continuity of these ideas where there is clearly not a direct textual transmission there. But somehow elements of these traditional ideas of like, okay, you've got to get these things from these 7 different places. And the fact that it's like, again, it's like 7 streams of water is a particular example that shows up in both places, where we see this continuity of practice, that these things have probably been transmitted in some way, that these different cultural elements have them. So the example that we'll go ahead and look at is from the second heaven. If you wish to silence a great and powerful people, or a governor or a judge, or the citizens of a city or of a state, take a handful of ashes from beneath the bread offering of an idol, and say over it backwards 7 times the names of the angels above on the first, that stand on the first step, and say, I ask from you, angels of silence, that in this place you silence every mouth and every heart of the children of Adam and Eve who arise against me to say anything evil. Let their mouth utter good things about me, and let me be exonerated in my lawsuit. Do not permit any mouth to speak evil about me. Then sprinkle the ashes either in the city or in the state, either before the governor or before the judge, and you will be exonerated. And so I picked this one for 2 reasons, or 3 reasons really. It's kind of a simple sounding one. There's not a lot of parts to it. You say the names of some angels, you steal an offering from an idol, and then say the angels' names backwards. You have an incantation explaining what you want to do, and then you sprinkle some ash in front of the governor or judge or through the city. So it sounds kind of simple, but you have to go steal from an idol. How are you going to do that? And then you're going to go sprinkle ash in front of this judge who's going to judge you. Like, he's going to just be like, what, are you crazy? Why are you throwing dirt on the ground? So I've actually done this spell and had a successful result with it. I was kind of worried because I had a traffic issue, and at first the attorney seemed like, yeah, no, like everything they did was wrong. You were fine. They're just picking on you, so we'll get this taken care of. And then the law firm switches attorneys on me. They don't really communicate to the new attorney what's going on. He seems kind of clueless about what's happening, and they both seem like they're just kind of phoning it in at this point. And I'm just like, oh my God, this was looking awesome, and now it's going to be awful. I'm like, I got to do something. So I used this, and everything got thrown out, and it was fine. I just basically had to like sit there for an hour and listen to some other cases. So the way that I did it was, I was like, okay, I'm a pagan. I don't want to steal from a god and insult that god. So I made an offering to my guardian angel and set up a shrine for the guardian angel, made the offering of bread for the guardian angel, and then took the bread back from the offering. So, because it was kind of like, guardian angel and I were bros, like, we're cool. Like, I've done Abramelin. He knows like what's going on. He gets it. He can pretend to be one of the Benai Elohim and pretend to be the god that I'm stealing from here. And so, and again, like Sarah Mastros would say, like, no. It's important that you are stealing from this oppressive institution of this pagan power. That is what's going on in the magic there. But I get that, but I was like, yeah, I think this cheat code works. And so, as far as sprinkling the ashes go, yeah, you're not going to walk up in front of a judge and just throw ashes on the ground at their feet. That's just crazy. So I went to the courthouse, and on my way, I sprinkled the ashes as I walked along the steps of the parking garage on my way in. And I could have, like, on the way into the courthouse, sprinkled them on the steps as I'm going up those steps. That probably would have been better, except also, like, much easier for someone to see and be like, what are you doing? And there'd probably be a lot of cops around there too. So you want to do things like that smart in ways that are going to work. But it worked completely well. I've used some other Sefer Haratzim spells and had things work out with them too. Sometimes they're very simple, and you basically are gonna just say some incantations and call upon the angels. Sometimes they are like more complicated, like the one with the 7 waters. You get these waters from 7 different sources of water. You put them in 7 unfired earthen vessels, and you can't mix the water together at all. Then you get a glass vial, and you talk about who you want to destroy to the glass vial, and then you put the waters from all the vessels into the vial and break the vessels and scatter the dust from it. And I forget what you do with the water and like what the next incantations are. There's a bunch of incantations in that one. But it's like, that one's like, if you want to destroy a fortified wall, if you want to capsize a ship, if you want to destroy someone's business, if you want to hurt your enemy, if you want to cause someone grief, it's like 20 different horrible things you can do to people, all with this one spell. And then it gives like, if you're doing this one, use this incantation. If you're doing this one, use this incantation. And so some of them are really complicated, and then some of them are pretty simple. And some of them are things that like seem like, well, this would just be impossible to do. But it is actually a really neat text, and a very small text. And you can get that one through Amazon. You can also find it online at this point. I think, like, legitimately, I think people who are associated with the publication have put it up through academia.edu. So it's one that's worth looking at if you're interested in those things. I guess for the final plug, Adjuring the Voice and the Glory has all the encampments of angels, has a ritual for working with them, describes working with them, but it does not describe the spells. So the way that Adjuring the Voice and the Glory approaches it as, these angels do these things, and it kind of describes the powers of the angels based on the description of them and based on the description of the spells, and then you just conjure the angels and tell the angels what you want to do. But if you want to work the traditional Sefer HaRatzim, then you would want to go get that text and then actually explore the spells and experiment with them and see how you can make them work in a modern context. But I hope that was interesting and useful. Again, there's like 3,000 years worth of magic there that we could possibly cover. So we had to pick the ones to cover. So hopefully we cover cool ones.
Yeah.
The we're past the time, so can't really leave much Q&A.
Can I
Um,
make some comments?
sure.
Well, it's totally what I do. It's like they try to make the world work.
Yeah.
I love it. Two, I don't know if you're around here, but it seems like your day school is like 40 minutes away.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Nice. That's awesome. Well,
Like Christianity tried to like root out magic, and
mhm.
Judaism kind of it's just ingrained.
Yeah, it's just sort of.
It is
Yeah.
doing like so like it's just part of the culture.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's just like most traditional cultures are like that, and I
Yeah.
think that's the thing that I think a lot of people forget that Judaism is a traditional religion. It's a traditional culture. It's a survival from the ancient world that we still have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like they don't even think about it. It's like not even like this is what we do. Like yeah, so it's cool. I like that everybody.
Thank you.